If you think daylight makes the world safer, wait until you hear what happened inside a diner at high noon. The sun was merciless that day. It poured across the highway in thick, golden sheets that bounced off chrome bumpers and glass windows, painting the roadside diner in a glare so sharp it hurt to look at. Cars simmered in the lot, heat bending the air into waves. Inside, hum of the air conditioner fought to keep up. Plates clinked, forks scraped. The smell of bacon and burnt coffee thickened the air. It was the kind of place where people usually found comfort, but not today. She sat by the window, girl of 15, small, fragile, with a quietness that didn't come from shyness, but from necessity. Her wheelchair squeaked faintly when she shifted. Her soda sat in front of her, condensation dripping into a little pool on the table. She lifted it carefully, her hand trembling just enough to make the ice rattle. She sipped without looking up, hoping the noise of her straw would drown in the chaos around her. But cruelty doesn't need an invitation, it only needs a victim. The door burst open with a squeak of sneakers. 3 boys, no older than 17, swaggered in with laughter already spilling out of them. Baseball caps backward, confidence painted on their faces. The waitress stiffened at the counter. She'd seen them before. She knew the type, restless, careless, looking for trouble because the day was too quiet otherwise. Their eyes swept the room once, then landed on her, the girl in the wheelchair, alone, vulnerable. Their laughter sharpened. They didn't waste time. The tallest of them leaned against her booth, too close, smiling the kind of smile that carries no warmth. The girl stared at her lap, gripping her straw tighter. She knew what was coming. She'd felt this kind of attention before, and it always ended the same way. The slap was quick, sharp, a crack of skin against skin that echoed far louder than it should have. Her soda tipped, spilling across the table, ice tumbling onto the floor. Her cheek burned red. The diner froze. The silence was immediate, heavy. A fork clinked against a plate. A mother pulled her child closer without meeting the girl's eyes. The man at the counter lowered his newspaper but didn't stand. The cook's spatula hovered above the grill. Nobody moved, nobody said a word. The girl's chest heaved, but she refused to cry. That defiance made them crueler. Another slap, louder. Gasps rippled through the diner, but no one stepped forward. The waitress gripped the edge of her notepad, trembling but didn't speak. One boy grabbed the handle of her wheelchair, jerking it back with a screech of rubber against tile. She fumbled for the wheels, powerless to move against his strength. Her humiliation deepened with every second. The world was watching, and the world was silent. Outside, the sun poured through the windows like judgment, bright, unforgiving, making every detail impossible to ignore. There was no shadow to hide in, no excuse of darkness. This was daylight cruelty, plain and exposed. Eventually, boredom crept into their laughter. Cruelty had limits when there was no fight left in the victim. With one final shove, they released her wheelchair and strutted toward the door, sneakers squeaking, laughter swelling as they shoved each other into the daylight. The door swung shut behind them. The diner exhaled as conversations pretended to resume. Plates clattered again, though shakier now, but no one looked at her. No one said a word. She sat in silence, soda dripping onto the floor, her cheeks stinging, her hands trembling too hard to grip the wheels. The shame wasn't just in what they had done, it was in what everyone else hadn't. Then the door opened again. Not with laughter, not with swagger, with weight. Heavy paws pressed onto the diner's tiles, a collar tag jingled once, clear as a bell. Heads turned, a dog. A canine, he filled the doorway before stepping in, coat shimmering sable and black, muscles taut beneath his fur. His eyes swept the room with deliberate focus, sharp and intelligent. He wasn't wandering, wasn't searching for scraps. He had come with purpose. The diner stilled once more. The waitress's lips parted in shock. The cook leaned further out, grease dripping from his spatula. Even the man at the counter lowered his paper completely. The girl lifted her head, her breath caught, their eyes met. The canine moved forward, steady, each paw step firm on the tile. He lowered his head, sniffing at the shards of ice, the sticky soda pooling on the floor, the sharp temps of fear lingering in the air. His ears twitched. His eyes returned to hers. She trembled, a tear sliding down her cheek, not from the slap, but from the sudden relief of not being invisible. She whispered so faintly it was almost a thought. "Hi." The dog's ears flicked. He stepped closer, pressing his nose against the wheel of her chair. She gasped, but didn't pull away. Her hand hovered, hesitant. Would he let her? He nudged her hand with his head, gently but firmly. Her fingers closed slowly against his fur, coarse and warm. Her trembling eased. The silence of the diner shifted. It wasn't cowardice anymore. It was The K9 held her gaze one last time, then turned his head toward the door. His ears perked, his muscles tensed. The boy's laughter still echoed faintly outside. He hadn't forgotten. The girl's hand froze on his fur. She followed his gaze, heart pounding. Was he going after them? The K9 stepped back, gave a short, deliberate snort, then faced the door again. His entire body aligned with intent. He wasn't here just to comfort. He had come to act. The girl gripped her wheels, torn between fear and a strange, rising courage. For the first time all day, she wanted to move. The diner seemed to lean with him, everyone watching, waiting. The dog strode to the door. His tag jingled once, sharp against the silence. He pushed the door with his weight, sunlight spilling in bright around his frame. The girl whispered again, stronger this time. "Please." The door swung shut behind him. Outside, the boys' laughter still carried faintly across the lot. They didn't know the sound following them now wasn't silence anymore. It was pause, heavy, steady, unstoppable. Daylight had witnessed cruelty. Now daylight was about to witness justice. The K9 has left the diner, following the bullies. The girl, still trembling, feels the pull of movement for the first time, and the audience knows the real story is just beginning. The heat outside hit like a wall. The K9 slipped through the door into the blinding brightness of midday, his paws silent against the hot pavement. The air smelled of gasoline, fried food, and something sharper. Fresher human sweat, adrenaline, the sour temps of cheap deodorant masking it. He locked onto the trail instantly. The boys were only half a block ahead, their laughter spilling into the street, careless, victorious. They had no idea the diner door had opened again, that another set of eyes had fixed on them. Inside, the girl sat frozen in her chair, staring at the door that had just shut behind him. Her chest tightened with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Fear, yes, but layered with something brighter. For the first time in an hour, her heartbeat wasn't just racing from humiliation, it was racing from hope. She turned her hands over her wheels, feeling the slickness of soda against her palms. The sound of his collar's jingle still echoed in her ears. The diner tried to return to normal. Coffee poured, plates clattered, the cook cursed at his grill, but every so often, a pair of eyes flicked toward the window, toward the sunlit lot where the K9's shadow had vanished. The silence he left behind clung heavier than the silence of fear. Out on the street, the boys slowed their pace, kicking at loose gravel, pushing each other with rough shoves. One lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward into the glaring sky. They didn't look back. Why would they? No one had stopped them. Nobody ever did. But the K9 didn't need an invitation. He trailed them with the precision of instinct honed to purpose. Every movement was deliberate, every pause a calculation. His ears flicked at the sound of sneakers scuffing pavement, his nose low, sweeping the hot ground where their scent clung. They smelled of sweat, cheap cologne, and something meaner, the kind of adrenaline high that came only from causing pain. He didn't growl. Not yet. His silence was heavier than sound. The boys reached the edge of the lot, where weeds pushed up through cracked asphalt. Beyond it stretched an empty field, tall grass swaying in the lazy wind. They cut across it, their shadows long and thin in the afternoon sun. The K9 followed, his body lowering slightly as he melted into the rhythm of the hunt. Back at the diner, the girl's fingers curled around the rims of her wheels. She couldn't stop hearing it, the slap, the laughter, the silence. But layered over it now was the memory of fur beneath her palm, the weight of a gaze that hadn't looked away from her. For the first time, she rolled forward. Not much, just a single push of her chair, away from the sticky puddle of soda on the floor. It was small, clumsy, almost invisible, but it was hers. The waitress caught the movement, her throat tightening. She wanted to speak, but no words came. So she just nodded at the girl, a small gesture, as if to say, "I saw that, I see you." In the field, the boys' laughter cracked through the open air. They shoved each other, the cigarette passing from hand to hand. They didn't notice the grass parting silently behind them. They didn't notice the glint of eyes that never wavered. The canine slowed, his head tilted, ears pricked forward. A scent cut sharper now, fear, but not theirs. Something else lingered here. He pressed his nose to the dirt, sniffing at a patch where the grass had been crushed. A faint trace of blood mixed with rust and metal. Old, but not forgotten, his body stiffened. This wasn't just about the boys. The field carried other stories, cruel ones, forgotten ones. He raised his head, eyes narrowing on the three figures, still striding ahead. His tail flicked once. His muscles tensed, not just for pursuit, but for something bigger. He could smell it, danger layered beneath cruelty, hidden beneath daylight. The boys finally slowed, one dropping onto the dry grass, laughing, pulling his cap lower against the sun. Their laughter was still sharp, but lighter now, like the violence inside the diner had already faded from their memory. To them, it was nothing. To the girl, it had been everything. To the K9, it was unforgivable. He crept closer, each paw pressed silently against the cracked earth, his breath steady, his eyes locked. At the diner, the girl rolled another push forward. Her wheels squeaked faintly, and she flinched at the sound, but she didn't stop. Another push, another. She reached the doorframe, sunlight burning her eyes as she stared out at the field. She couldn't see them, not from here, but she could feel the pull of distance, the sense that something was happening just beyond her reach, and she knew he was out there. The canine paused within striking distance, his body lowered, muscles coiled. His breath was quiet, controlled. His ears tuned to the cadence of their voices, every shout, every laugh. He could end it in seconds, but he waited. Because this wasn't about attack, it was about timing, about truth, about something the boys didn't yet realize. Daylight doesn't hide cruelty, it remembers it. The smallest of them glanced up suddenly, eyes narrowing. "Hey, you hear that?" The others laughed, but the boy shook his head, standing, peering into the tall grass. The cigarette burned low between his fingers. His skin prickled. A sound carried, then not a growl. Not yet, just the faint jingle of a tag, carried on the breeze. The boy's hand froze. The grass shifted. And for the first time since they'd walked out of the diner, the laughter faltered. The sun had shifted by the time the boys reached the far edge of the lot, leaning into the open stretch of field beyond. What from a distance looked like an ordinary piece of land, yellowing grass, scattered weeds, the shimmer of heat lifting from the dirt up close, carried a different kind of weight. The grass whispered against their jeans as they pushed through, seeds snapping against fabric. The air thicker, more stagnant here than it had been on the highway. Cicadas shrilled from somewhere unseen, a sound so constant it felt like pressure building in the ears. They didn't notice the silence that followed behind them when the dog emerged from the diner door. They didn't turn at the faint sound of claws against cracked pavement or the low creak of the door swinging shut. They were still basking in the shallow triumph of what they had done inside. Still drunk on the adrenaline of humiliation disguised as power, their laughter was sharp, without rhythm. Rising and falling in sudden bursts that scattered across the field like crows startled from the grass, the canine moved with none of that chaos. His gait was steady, deliberate, each paw falling soundless against the earth. He kept his head low at first, nose close enough to the ground to taste the scent trail woven into the grass. Sweat, smoke, the faint metallic temps of coins or keys jostled in their pockets. Every footstep they had left behind still breathed here, visible to him, though no human eye could read it. He didn't rush. He never needed to. Pursuit wasn't about speed, it was about certainty. And certainty was his gift. From the doorway of the diner, the girl squinted against the sunlight, blinking hard as her eyes adjusted from the dimness inside to the glare outside. The wheels of her chair pressed against the metal lip of the threshold, refusing to budge without force. But she leaned forward, trying to peer into the brightness beyond the lot. She couldn't see much, the shimmer of heat rising in sheets, the wavering outline of grass beyond the asphalt. But she knew, every part of her body hummed, with the knowledge that he was out there. Her fingers gripped the rim of her wheels tighter. Her palms were sticky from spilled soda. Her cheek still ached faintly where the slap had landed. But her heart was racing for an entirely different reason now. Something had shifted in her. The weight of shame, of humiliation, was no longer the only thing filling her chest. There was a thread of something else weaving through its anticipation, fragile but unmistakable. She had not been left behind. Inside the diner, the conversations that had started up again faltered each time someone glanced at her. The waitress wanted to help, wanted to push her chair forward into the sunlight, but her feet stayed rooted where they were. The cook retreated to his grill, banging pans louder than needed, as if noise could drown out the guilt that had settled over the room. Nobody stopped her from moving toward the door. Nobody tried to call her back. Perhaps they knew this wasn't about them anymore. It had never been. The boys slowed when they reached the middle of the field, their laughter trailing into small bursts of chatter. One dropped into the grass, lying on his back with his cap pulled down low, cigarette smoke curling above him. Another kicked at the dirt, restless, pretending bravado even when there was no one to perform for. The third lingered on the edges, his eyes darting to the tree line that framed the far side of the field. He felt it before the others did, the sense of being watched. The K9 had stopped 20 yards behind them, crouched low where the grass rose taller. His chest expanded slowly with each breath, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The scents here were layered, their sweat, the ash of the cigarette, the faint rust of old metal. And beneath it all, something older, sourer, buried into the earth itself. A trace of blood, long dried but not forgotten, clinging to a piece of discarded barbed wire half buried in the weeds. He pressed his nose to it briefly, ears twitching, then lifted his gaze again. This land had seen cruelty before, and it was seeping through the soil like a stain, but his focus returned to them. The smallest of the boys sat up abruptly, pulling off his cap to wipe sweat from his forehead. His eyes scanned the grass. "Hey," he muttered, voice lower than before. "Do you hear that?" The others laughed, mocking him for his nerves, but he didn't smile. He tilted his head, listening. The cicadas screamed, the wind pushed the grass in lazy waves, and somewhere behind it, faint but undeniable, came the light jingle of metal. A tag against a collar, steady, rhythmic, carried just far enough for the ear to catch, but not place. The boy's laughter faltered. He stood, turning toward the sound. His skin prickled as though the sun had burned him too long. "I'm serious. Something's out there." The tallest shoved his shoulder, scoffing. "It's a field, idiot. There's always noise," but his voice was thinner now, stretched tight around the edges. The canine shifted one paw forward. The grass rustled, then stilled. He did not rush, did not reveal himself fully. He wanted them to feel it first, the weight of knowing they were not alone. His eyes gleamed through the stalks, catching the reflection of sun. He lowered his head again, chest pressed closer to the ground, a hunter disguised by patience. Back at the diner, the girl finally pushed harder on her wheels. The chair lurched forward over the threshold, the sudden brightness of the sun hitting her full in the face. She blinked rapidly, breath shallow, heart hammering. For a moment, she simply sat there on the edge of the lot, the highway stretching in one direction, the open field in the other. She couldn't see him, but she felt him. It was as if the invisible thread between them tugged tighter, pulling her forward into daylight. She whispered into the heat, though no one was near enough to hear. "Find them." The boys shifted again. The tallest kicked the grass harder, his forced laughter filling the air, trying to drown out the unease building between them. But unease had a sound of its own, and it was growing louder. The smallest turned again, squinting into the sunlit stalks, his chest rising faster now. The canine inhaled once, deep, steady, then exhaled in silence, his tail lowered, his ears angled forward. He wasn't just following anymore, he was preparing. The field held its breath. And for the first time since leaving the diner, the boys began to realize daylight wasn't theirs to hide in. The sun bore down heavier as the afternoon stretched, the air thick with heat that clung to skin and clothes like an unwelcome hand. The field, wide and flat, seemed endless. Each stalk of grass, shimmering in gold, bending beneath the weight of the sun. Cicadas screamed louder, a single, relentless chorus that made the silence between human voices sharper, more brittle. The three boys slowed, their confidence fraying at the edges. What had begun as triumphant laughter in the diner had thinned into restless chatter, then into uneven bursts of noise that carried more bravado than ease. The smallest of them glanced behind again, eyes darting over the tall grass, and wiped the sweat from his brow with a shaky hand. He didn't say anything this time. He didn't have to. The unease was written across his posture, the stiffness in his movements, the way his breath came shorter than before. The tallest boy lit another cigarette, smoke curling against the bright sky, and puffed it out in exaggerated confidence. "You're both acting like babies," he muttered, tossing his lighter back into his pocket. "It's a field. There's nothing here." His tone tried to carry authority, but the way his fingers tapped against his thigh betrayed nerves he couldn't mask. The canine had stopped just beyond their sight, half hidden in the grass that brushed against his chest. His ears angled forward, his gaze locked onto their shifting forms. The earth beneath him was hot, the scent of dry weeds and old rust filling his nose. But layered above it all was their smell, sweat sharp with adrenaline, the chemical temps of smoke, the faint metallic residue of coins and keys. It was more than enough to track. He didn't lunge, he didn't bark. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, his paws pressing the soil with quiet certainty, each movement precise. The grass parted just enough to reveal the glint of his eyes. One of the boys froze. "Did you see that?" the smallest whispered, his voice breaking. The tallest scoffed but didn't look directly. "It's nothing, wind bugs." But the one in the middle swallowed hard and took a step back, his sneakers crunching against dry dirt. "That's not the wind. Something's there." They turned, at last, to face it. The grass swayed again, but not with the rhythm of air. This was controlled, steady, deliberate. The canine emerged in slow measure, each detail revealing itself. The broad chest, the strong shoulders, the shimmer of his sable-black coat under the sun. His head was low, his eyes sharp, his ears fixed forward. His presence filled the space like a shadow, in daylight impossible, undeniable. The boy's bravado faltered. The smallest stumbled back a step, grabbing the arm of the one beside him. "It's a police dog," he whispered harshly. The tallest laughed, though it cracked at the edges. "What's he gonna do, huh? Bite us for walking in a field?" He puffed his cigarette again, pretending he wasn't rattled, though his eyes never left the dog's slow approach. The canine didn't need to bite, he didn't even need to growl. The weight of his stare was enough. It carried something the boys weren't used to: accountability. Back at the edge of the diner's lot, the girl pushed harder on her wheels. Her arms trembled with effort, each turn grinding against the rough pavement, but she didn't stop. Sweat clung to her forehead, the heat pressing heavy on her skin, but her focus was steady. She couldn't see the field clearly from where she was, not with the glare of the sun, but she could feel it, she knew. The waitress had stepped outside by then, standing uncertainly in the doorway, a dish towel clenched in her hand. She didn't try to stop the girl. Instead, she just watched, eyes shining with something like shame, something like awe. As the child who had been slapped silent inside moments earlier now moved forward with a determination no one had expected. The girl whispered to herself, each word a push of her wheels, "Keep going." The field seemed to pulse with tension. The cicadas shrieked, the wind shifted. The canine stopped a few paces from the boys. He stood tall now, no longer crouched. His chest rose and fell with slow breaths, his stance square and immovable. The cigarette slipped from the tallest boy's hand, falling into the grass where it hissed faintly before dying. None of them bent to retrieve it. The smallest finally found his voice, though it trembled. "We didn't do anything." The dog tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the sound. His ears flicked back for a moment, then forward again. His gaze sharpened, unwavering. The boy swallowed hard, looking at his friends for support, but none of them spoke. Their bravado had cracked under the weight of silence. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. The girl's wheelchair rolled off the lip of the pavement and onto the first strip of grass. The front wheels wobbled, catching slightly on the uneven ground, but she pressed forward, teeth gritted, arms straining. The tall grass brushed against her knees, the earth uneven and rough beneath her chair, but she didn't stop. Every inch forward was a fight, every push was defiance. And each time the wheels turned, the connection she felt to the canine grew stronger, pulling her toward him, toward whatever waited in the field. The waitress clutched the towel tighter, tears pricking her eyes. She whispered into the heat, though the girl couldn't hear her. "Go, sweetheart, don't stop." In the field, the boys took another step back. The tallest tried to laugh again, but the sound withered in his throat. The canine advanced a single step, steady, deliberate, and the distance between them felt like a wall closing in. The smallest whispered again, desperate this time. "We didn't do anything." But they had, and the canine had seen. The field fell silent, except for the cicadas, shrill and unrelenting. The air grew heavier, the sun sharper, the grass bending in the weight of it. And in that stillness, courage took form, a dog standing unflinching before cruelty. A girl pushing forward through the rough edges of earth, strangers holding their breath at the edge of a story they didn't yet understand. Daylight had exposed the cruelty. Now it was witnessing something else: resistance. And resistance, once begun, does not stop easily. Heat shimmered above the field like a veil, the afternoon sun flattening every color, bleaching the world until even the boys' shadows seemed thinner than before. They had stopped pretending not to be afraid. Their feet edged back in the grass. Their glances skittered between the trees and the animal that held them steady in place with nothing but breath and presence. The canine stood as if he had always belonged to this patch of earth. Chest lifted, ears forward, eyes fixed with a patience that felt older than any of them. He didn't rush, he didn't snap, he didn't give them the excuse of a sudden move. He simply waited until they understood that daylight takes notes. The smallest boy's gaze fell first. His chin dipped, then his shoulders, the bravado shedding off him like dust in a gust. We didn't mean the sentence died when he realized there was no believable ending to that thought. Meaning doesn't unspill a drink, or unbruise a cheek, or unmake the hush that keeps harm alive. Down at the edge of the lot, the wheelchair bumped and scraped into the grass, one stubborn inch at a time. The girl leaned forward with her whole body, pushing through the drag of weeds that caught the wheels and the little ruts that tried to claim them. Sweat glued her shirt to her spine. Bits of seed and chaff clung to her knees. She could have called for help. She could have waited for someone to notice. Instead, she chose the harder thing, the thing that every muscle in her arms protested against, the thing that was hers to choose. When the front casters snagged in a tuft, she didn't cry out. She gritted her teeth and rocked the chair and found a rhythm. Breath and push, until the wheels cleared, with a sticky sigh, and rolled again. The waitress had come as far as the last concrete square before the grass. She had no words for what sat in her throat, her eyes fixed on the girl's shoulders, on the effort there, on the small quiver at her wrists as she leaned into the push. The dish towel hung forgotten from her fingers. Twice she started forward, and twice she stopped, because something about the girl's motion asked not for rescue, but for witness. The man from the counter stepped outside to blinking into the glare with the posture of someone who hadn't stood up when he should have, and was trying now to make sense of that weight. A delivery driver paused at the curb, one hand on a dolly stacked with boxers, his gaze pulled across the lot as if by a tide. Even the cook's face appeared in the diner's window for a moment. The grease-smeared reflection caught in the glass like a confession. Out in the field, the canine took a step left, just a shift of weight, a line drawn in the grass with the geometry of a shepherd. The boys corrected their own feet without quite knowing why, clustering away from the tree line, closer to the openness that exposed them. The tallest tried to smirk and found he'd forgotten how. Then, from the road came the low roll of a vehicle slowing down, tires whispering over sun-soft tar. A dark SUV eased to the curb at the diner's edge, hazard lights blinking a faint metronome against the sun. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out in an unhurried motion, a rectangle of shade falling and then folding as he closed the door gently with his forearm. He wasn't in full uniform, but the shape of his stance, the clipped hair, and the subtle rectangle under his shirt at his belt said enough. He shaded his eyes, scanned the lot once, and then tracked what every gaze had been pulled to: a girl in a wheelchair inching into a field, 3 boys caught in a circle of their own making, and a dog who owned the silence. He didn't call out, he didn't break the spell. He walked to the diner's edge and stopped beside the waitress, not even glancing at her. His focus was ahead. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. Yours. The waitress swallowed hard. No, he just came. Sometimes they do, the man said, as if that explained it, and as if it didn't need more. The girl found a rhythm that carried her. The ruddy ground stole half the force of every push. But she learned to overcompensate, to use the little bounce of the chair's frame, to pull, and then drive through the sticky drag. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't smooth, but it was relentless. When she lifted her eyes and saw the dog's outline fully know, the slope of his shoulders, the exact angle of his ears, the steadiness her breath caught and expanded at the same time, she had never asked anything of anyone with just a look, not like this. But that was the language between them, a promise spoken in the way she kept going, and he didn't move from where he had chosen to stand. The tallest boy finally cracked, "We're leaving," he blurted and took a step. But the canine flowed to the side with him, and that was somehow worse than a block. To be prevented by patience, to be stopped by stillness, it unthreaded something inside him that shouting never could. The cigarette on the ground had burned itself to ash. He ground it under his heel as if that were the insult that mattered. The man by the curb shifted, the faintest adjustment of weight. And that was when the canine tilted his head the smallest degree without taking his eyes from the boys. The recognition was subtle and total. The dog didn't belong to anyone here, not in the way a leash would declare. But he knew how to read a center of gravity shared with a human he trusted, and he had found one now. It wasn't obedience, it was alignment. "Hey," the middle boy said, voice quivering in the sun-thick air. "We didn't. It was just," he ran out of breath before he ran out of excuses. The girl reached them without quite reaching them, the last yards of grass taking their tax, the chair's rear wheels slipping, biting, inching, but not giving back what she poured in. When she couldn't get closer without risking a tumble, she stopped and let the world catch up to her pulse. She didn't look at the boys first, she looked at the dog, a tiny nod. She had no authority to give, but she gave it anyway. The canine exhaled once, a soft sound that folded into the cicadas. Then, for the first time since the diner door had clicked behind him, he made noise that wasn't just breath, a single bark, deep and precise, the kind of bark that holds boundaries. It wasn't a warning of violence. It was a demand for attention that carried the shape of a line, here and no further. Everything in the field seemed to rearrange around that sound. The boy's shoulders jerked, the smallest flinched and then looked up as if dragged, eyes bright with something that had finally pierced the bubble of his bravado. The tallest's mouth opened and closed. The middle one took an involuntary half-step forward, which turned out to be the only step that mattered. "I'm sorry," he said to the air between them, to the grass. To the dog who would not forgive or condemn, but only insist that the truth be spoken where everyone could hear it. Then he turned, not quite looking at the girl, and tried again, the words scraping out, "We shouldn't have." The apology wasn't pretty, and it wasn't complete, and it didn't change the past. It still mattered. In the diner's door, someone let out a breath that sounded like a small, broken thank you. The dog took another step forward, not to loom, but to shepherd. He angled his body in that quiet math that moves groups. The boys found their feet, taking the path he set for them without thinking. Back across the grass, each footfall making a new kind of sound, footsteps that weren't escaping, but returning. That was the most difficult direction for pride to travel. And yet it happened almost gently, as if the field itself had decided to make it easier once the first true word had been spoken. The man fell in 3 paces behind and to the side, letting the canine own the center of the scene. He didn't put a hand on anyone, he didn't have to. Presence is a tool, and he had learned to use it without drawing blood. When the boys reached the edge of the lot, he finally spoke, low and even. "You're going to come inside," he said, "and you're going to use your voices for something that helps." There was no question mark at the end of the sentence. The girl couldn't turn the chair as fast as the sudden shift of bodies around her. She didn't have to. The dog doubled back, crossing the grass with that same steady gait, and approached her not as a hero returning from a victory, but as a friend reporting back from a job. Head lowering as he came close enough that his breath stirred the loose strands of hair at her temple, he pressed his forehead gently, deliberately, to the side of her knee. It was not an ask and not a demand. It was a touch with a single meaning: "I am with you." She lifted her palm, hovering for a heartbeat, then set it on his head. The roughness of his fur, warm from the sun, grounded her in a way no word ever had. Her hand shook and then steadied. The canine's eyes closed halfway at the pressure. That was the first time she smiled that day. small and crooked and fierce as anything she'd ever done. "Can I help?" The man's voice had changed when he spoke to her. He had shaved the shape of authority from it and left only the ridge of care. He crouched a little to take the heat-blurred edge off their height difference. "Name's Ethan," he added, not because she had asked and not because names fix things, but because it's a human way to step into a shared space and say, "I take responsibility for being here." She nodded because nodding cost less energy than answering, and because the word "thank you" was a knot in her throat that would take time to untie. He didn't touch the chair without her permission. He waited. When she tilted her chin toward the diner, he came around and took the push handles gently, testing the balance on the uneven ground, as if the chair were a fragile instrument. The K9 fell in at her side, so close that each turn of her wheels brushed the air near his shoulder. A pace set not by speed, but by accompaniment, they crossed back under the sun's witness. The boys had already reached the door, their earlier swagger blown out of them by a wind they couldn't name. The waitress stepped aside as they entered, the little bell above the door giving a cheerful ring that felt almost odd now, like laughter in a church, and yet not wrong. The diner wasn't a sacred space, but it had been turned into one by how many eyes had watched, and chosen and failed and then found themselves pulled into a better choice. Outside, the air conditioner met them with relief, so sudden it made the girls shiver. The smells of fry oil and coffee stitched themselves back around the edges of the scene. People rearranged in their seats to make room without being asked. Somebody moved a chair out of the path of the wheels. A child at a corner booth whispered a question and was shushed softly with a hand that stroked her hair instead of one that pulled her away. Ethan didn't choreograph the next moments, he let them happen. The boy stood near the booth where the ice had melted into a clear map of earlier harm. The smallest stared at the cracked gleam on the floor as if it might reflect a better version of himself back to him if he looked long enough. The tallest opened his mouth and then looked at the K9 and closed it again. The discipline of that small act may be the first real strength he had shown all day. The middle one found a rag under the counter and dropped to his knees without being told, swabbing at the sticky puddle, moving the way a person moves when they're trying to learn how to use their hands for repair instead of damage. It wasn't perfect. He missed spots. He scrubbed too hard, where gentle would have done. He kept going. The others followed, awkwardly wiping, collecting the shards of glass with the careful fear of a cut that could bleed what they hadn't meant to lose. The waitress brought a small dustpan and didn't say anything about liability, or policies, or the fact that this wasn't technically their job. She just held it steady, while shaking hands tipped broken pieces into its mouth. When there was nothing left to pick up, the smallest boy looked up at the girl for the first time and didn't look away. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time the sentence reached the end of itself. "We were wrong." It wasn't eloquent. It didn't have to be. She didn't say she forgave them because forgiveness isn't a coin you toss across a counter on demand. But she nodded, and in the nod there was relief and weariness and a crack of light that would widen with days she hadn't lived yet. The K9 leaned his weight a little against her shin. Ethan saw the pressure of that touch and adjusted his own. He stepped a fraction back so that the dog's body, not his, was the closest thing she felt. A man near the jukebox cleared his throat, the preamble to some speech people give when they realize a story could use a lesson. No one asked him to speak, and he didn't, because the lesson was already unfolding in front of him, and he had been given the smarter role. To watch and reshape the story he would tell himself about this place and this day. Ethan wrote something small and neat on a folded receipt with a blunt pencil, his name again, his phone number, a reminder of a youth program 2 towns over that he said helps kids turn the energy into something that pays them back instead of emptying them out. He slid it toward the boys without looking like a savior or a cop with a quota for redemption. They took it because their hands didn't know what else to do if they didn't. The waitress poured fresh water into a clean glass and set it on the girl's table with a napkin she unfolded and smoothed like an apology. "Honey," she said, voice steadier now, "you want anything else?" The girl shook her head and then changed it to a small nod. "Maybe, just water." For she glanced down at the dog and then up, embarrassed at her own boldness. "Got a bowl in the back," the cook called without prompting. And when he emerged, he held a metal dish that looked like it had been used to catch drips beneath a leaky pipe once upon a time. Scrubbed to something like gleam, water shimmering in it, he set it on the floor near the girl's wheel. The canine waited for her tiny motion with her hand, a little gesture of invitation, and then bent to drink. Tongue careful against the lip, so the water stayed mostly where it belonged. For a few minutes, the diner remembered what it had been before. Fear hollowed it noisy, in the way places of comfort are, with forks and laughter, and the squeak of vinyl. But the noise had been clarified by what had happened. It felt less like distraction, and more like life choosing to be noisy on purpose so that pain had to work harder to be heard. Ethan leaned an elbow on the counter and asked the waitress for ice and a towel. He wrapped the bundle and handed it to the girl with a question in his eyebrows. She pressed it to her cheek and flushed, not from pain, but from the attention handled gently. "You did the hard part," he said. "The rest is paperwork and time." She looked past him to the dog. "What's his name?" she asked, and there was no fear in the question now, only curiosity shaped into gratitude. "He'll answer to a lot of things," Ethan said. The faintest smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Mostly to the person who needs him. You can call him what you want." She thought for a second, ice towel cooling the heat that had been her morning. "Hero," she murmured, then shook her head. "No, that's too big." She tried again. Buddy the canine lifted his head at the sound, not because the syllables were any magic word, but because the way she said them carried the truth of a small, unbreakable bond just forged. He stood, gave the tiniest shake that sent droplets from his whiskers to the tile, and placed his chin along the edge of her knee with a sigh that rumbled up from somewhere old and good. Outside, the sun had slid a little lower, the heat still heavy, but beginning to soften. A breeze nosed at the diner's red awning and made it pop and settle like a curtain before a second act. The boys drifted toward the door, shoulders still rounded but less rigid. Folding the receipt with Ethan's numbers so many times, it almost disappeared. They paused with hands on the chrome handle, looked back once not at the dog, not at Ethan, but at the girl land, then slipped out into light that, for the first time that day, didn't feel like an interrogation to them, but a thing they might eventually earn. The waitress took a breath that unwound a knot, then another, and then she leaned on the counter with both hands and laughed. A wet hiccuping sound that made the cook look over and shake his head and grin despite the grease on his apron. Someone fed the jukebox $1 and punched a selection so old it felt new again. Something with a guitar that twanged in a way that turned the air gold. Ethan checked the door with a habits glance, then looked back at the table where girl and dog occupied a circle of calm. "You got someone I can call for you?" he asked, the question gentle, practical. She nodded and gave him a name and a number, and when he dialed and handed her the phone, he didn't step away to give privacy. He just shifted his weight so that the dog remained the largest shape in her field of vision. "I'm okay," she said into the receiver after a pause. The words soft but surprised, like she was hearing them from someone else first and then trying them on. "Yes, I promise." Someone helped. What daylight keeps is not just the memory of harm, it keeps the shape of the person you become afterward, the angle of your shoulders when you decide to move, the warmth of a dog's head against your knee, the exact weight of a hand that chooses to push only when asked. It keeps the geometry of a field where patience did more than punishment, a diner where shame loosened its grip just enough to let courage come in and sit a while. When the call was done, Ethan took the phone and slid it into his pocket with the ease of a man who'd carry something for you until you wanted it back. He rested his fingers for a second on the back of the chair, feeling the slight hum of her breathing through the frame. "You did good," he said simply. The girl looked at the dog instead of him, because that was where her thanks belonged first. "You came," she whispered, and then, because sunlight sometimes pulls truth straight through the thin places between people and the animals who find them, she added, "You stayed." The canine blinked slow, the kind of blink that isn't sleep, but trust, and shifted his weight closer until their shadows merged on the floor in a shape that hadn't existed that morning and would never quite come apart again. And that day in a diner that had tried to mind its own business until it remembered it had a better one, the dog didn't just stop a hurt. He taught a room how to look toward the light and stay there.